Today I'm speaking with Lars and Christie Cade. Lars and Christie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Glad to be here again.
And we've got another interview that we did previously. I'll have the interview link for that beneath this video, but I'm not going to do a long intro because we did that before, but I'll do a quick one just so everyone has a context if this is your first interview with Lars and Christie. Lars and Christie Cade live in Raleigh, North Carolina, and Lars studied at Capital College and Christie at North Carolina State University. And Christie also studied at Cedarville University, and she's a chemistry instructor at Wake Technical Community College. Lars is the son of missionaries who grew up in a house church. He was homeschooled, the whole nine yards, Awana, young earth creationism, that kind of stuff. We talked about some of those things in the previous interview. So if some of that is of interest to you, especially with the young earth stuff, feel free to jump into that interview. But we're going to tackle some different topics today, more topical instead of their particular story, although your story will obviously weave in. But we're going to start with the topic of purity culture. So before we jump in, is there anything else you want to say? And then we'll jump right in.
That sounds like a good intro. Thanks.
Cool. Well, I'm again so glad to have you here again. And for purity culture, could we start with just the definition, and then you can dive into your stories and how that affected you? But what is purity culture and all the other titles like virginity culture, shame culture, etc.?
I guess the main idea is that you don't have sex until you're married, and you only have sex with, between a man and a woman being married. But there's just a lot of stuff leading up to marriage that gets into it. Of how do you date? Are you allowed to date? Is courtship a thing? Are you allowed to kiss? All sorts of things.
Yeah, the way it was for me, it was the messages given were inadvertently, though sometimes more explicit than others, that basically anything to do with the fleshly human body is at the very best tainted and impure. At worst, it's automatically shameful and sinful and all that. If you look in the New Testament, for example, there's frequent mentions of the flesh or the body or the natural man, and not one of them is good. At most, Christians are urged to glorify God in your body and your spirit. But even then, the idea that the body itself is a good thing, not really in there. And it's frequently used with negative terms. And, so this has pervaded Christianity and, let's face it, many other controlling religions for a long time. The way it was presented in the 90s when we were growing up was heavily influenced by a book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye by a man named Josh Harris. Those of you familiar are probably rolling your eyes right now.
I actually got to see him in public or in person when he was doing his tour to different schools and so forth. I remembered when I hadn't remembered it for a while, but I actually remembered seeing him like in front of a group of 600 people or something doing his spiel.
Yeah. Was that his original tour back in the 90s or his apology tour more recently when he realized how much he'd hurt people?
The original one. Yeah, when he was back when he was preaching his I Kissed Dating Goodbye book.
Yeah. Fortunately, I think we both realized when we read it that taking dating advice from someone who was not even married at the time, and who basically got all his ideas from the Gospel of Jane Austen, might not have been the best idea. So we weren't affected in that particular way, although we know many people who were.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I ask, was there a sense too that if anybody who was single and looking, if anyone crossed certain boundaries, that almost inextricably put them in the category of you're definitely not God's will for me as a future spouse, because true love, to quote Josh McDowell's book, True Love Waits. But even if you're just doing anything it wasn't necessarily sex, but just any kind of touching or fondling, you would end up being in a spot where you'd be thinking to yourself after you were, going back to your separate homes that, wait a second, if they loved me, they would want to protect my heart. They didn't stop or whatever. And I'm not talking about people where someone says, please stop, and they don't. I'm talking about where both people mutually enjoy each other, but where they don't stop themselves. And therefore, it's like, wait a second, they don't really love me. They're just being selfish. Therefore, if I want to pursue God, I need to get away from them, even though I was part of it in the first place. Does that ring a bell at all?
It's at least something that we had in mind. Like we both had those rules about like what kind of touching we were going to allow ourselves to do and what kind of touching we weren't going to allow ourselves to do. And we were on the same page there. But like, I don't think we would have been interested in dating someone who did not have those same rules.
Yeah. For us, we were allowed to kiss and touch non-underwear areas.
Yeah, that makes sense.
What we did.
For anyone that had broken those rules, like just your friends, and say you had friends that went all the way, how would the Christian community have typically treated them?
I was definitely a judgmental jerk about it. It's one of the many ways that morality based on rules rather than values can warp your conscience and turn you into a worse person. Again, it's not exclusive to Christianity. It's not even exclusive to religion. Political ideologies end up doing the same thing. People turn into jerks because they value their rules more than the people that are actually affected by them. I was very sheltered. I didn't, to my knowledge, though I'm sure I did, have any friends who went all the way. But those who crossed the boundaries that I didn't think they should have crossed, yeah, I looked down on them, and I was sometimes vocally, sometimes just quietly judgmental about it.
Yeah. Can I ask, I know we're going to get maybe into your story a little bit as to how this wove into your experience, but just stepping back a little bit for the context first, there's a sense too that I know I had, and I think a lot of people would nod their assent to as well, that when you're growing up in Christianity, besides just this purity culture message that does eventually come, there's an underlying theme of we're not really going to talk about it much, and it's kind of like it's a secret. So when the Victoria's Secret catalog comes or whatever, the JCPenney catalog comes back in the day, like there's certain things you just don't look at, and we don't want to talk about it too much. And you'll know someday, and there might be even sermons here or there that you pick up on throughout the years of like, this is a wonderful gift from God. But in reality, in practicality, it's like, don't talk about it, don't look, and definitely if you accidentally look, don't look twice. And how did the secrecy part of it come out, or not even secrecy, just a lack of information come out for you all?
That's where this really hits my story hard. I was homeschooled all the way from kindergarten through high school. So obviously it was pretty much up to my parents to determine how and what I was educated on. I had no sex ed, pretty much. So up through the age of 10 or so, I remember twice during family Bible reading time, my dad asked the kids, what does this mean where it says that he went into his wife? I think it was referring to the story of Adam and Eve. And I responded with, they committed sex. Because the only time I'd heard the word sex up to that point was, the conversation would pause, the tone would hush, and it'd be like, sex, and then it would resume. Making it very clear, and of course all the other mentions of the dangers of sexuality in the Bible, or at least in sermons, it made it very clear that it was not something that good people did, or that people should do. So then on my 11th birthday, I was so cool that I had one birthday guest, and we were driving him home, and on the way back, my dad asked me, if I knew what sex was like, because he was like, I'm sure you're going to be starting to like girls pretty soon. No, I wasn't. I was absolutely not interested in that. I didn't have rushed until I was about 15, but didn't let that stop him. He gave me a very, very perfunctory description of the anatomy, and that was it. It was the most traumatic event of my entire life, without question. Worse than loved ones dying, worse than injuries. Absolutely most traumatic event of my life in terms of negative impact on me over the course of my life. Because there was no mention of anything like pleasure, desire, arousal, receptivity, genital compatibility, or motion, anything involved in like actual sexual relationships. No, there was just the one goes into the other, and that's it. I didn't realize that they would fit together. I thought it was like trying to ram a carrot through a drinking straw. But and I figured it would be excruciating, not to mention shameful, because one would have to be naked. And
Yeah.
as mentioned earlier, I had the idea that the human body was inherently shameful, evil, disgusting, all that stuff.
Which you do get in Genesis, and was that God's kicking them out of the garden.
Right. I got the part where, they ate the fruit and were naked and ashamed. You had a somewhat better perspective on it.
Yeah, I kind of took the opposite view where the perfect state is before the fall, and before the fall they were not ashamed. So it's good to be not ashamed, and then then they had the fall and they were ashamed, and being ashamed is more the bad state.
I saw it as the inevitable state, right, where we were post Adam and Eve, and therefore it was shameful. Like, I saw shame as like an inherent property of things.
Yeah.
See, I don't so much anymore, but so it was just terrible. And I, about a year later, tried to tell my dad, hey, this is the worst thing I've ever heard. Why did you tell me this? And rather than say, hey, okay, let's talk about this, let's go back to basics, understand why this might be a good thing, because I'd never really heard that it was a good thing. And up to that point, the only things I knew about genitals were that you always wash your hands after you touch them, that you didn't touch them when people could see, and that they were used for urination, which was gross. That was all I knew. And so I asked, why would you tell me this? And rather than, going back to basics, like I said, he launched into this bizarre analogy of comparing nudity to God revealing himself in the temple or tabernacle in the Holy of Holies once a year with the high priest. Now, to someone who already didn't like the idea of sex, hearing that it is something comparable to a life and death situation done at most once a year might not have been the best message.
With the rope tied around your ankle in case
the
he
rope
strikes
tied
you
around
dead.
his ankle just in case he drops dead. Suffice it to say, I did not look to my parents again for information about sex after that. In fact, I actively avoided learning anything more about it. When Family Bible reading came time to read the Song of Solomon, I literally plugged my ears for the whole thing. Not that you should be reading that to kids, but they were, and I didn't want to hear it. So, like you were mentioning the catalogs that you weren't supposed to look at, I didn't just think I wasn't supposed to look at them. I obviously had been told I shouldn't, but I definitely didn't. It was, I didn't want to know more. I even, when I did start having crushes on girls, I lied to my parents about it, which I hate doing. I don't lie, pretty much, but I lied to my parents about this because I didn't want to get another sex talk.
Did you have a
Yeah.
sense that if you got married, that it would all be good then? Like that marriage would just redeem everything?
No, I resolved myself that I would never have sex.
Okay.
It did not, I couldn't understand why anyone would do it. To make an analogy, imagine if someone told you that for reasons beyond your comprehension, people would occasionally sit down, break out a copy of Mein Kampf, read it out loud while consuming feces laced with glass. It was evil, disgusting, bizarre, and shameful all at once. And painful too. I didn't realize that these things actually fit together. And so, it didn't occur to me that anyone would ever do that on purpose. I just couldn't comprehend why they made such a big deal out of it.
Can I ask, had you ever seen like either on a farm or even like a video of animals mating? Had that become part of the equation?
Well, not in enough detail. Oddly enough, when in that initial conversation when I was 11, my dad did say, "Oh, you mate with your wife," and I didn't know what that meant. And so then he explained, and that was the end of it. And so this meant that, for example, I discovered masturbation and pubic hairs without knowing what those things were or that they would happen. And felt like some sort of freak.
Your knowledge of mating of animals were somewhere that it was like sticking it in like a needle.
Yeah, like the only ones that I remember seeing were birds, where they like, and they're done. They're incredibly fast. So yeah, I had no understanding that it was any sort of drawn out process, that motion would be involved or anything like that. And so it was, I was not just uninformed, but misinformed, because then whatever I did learn about, I learned from pop culture. And especially in the 90s and early 2000s, it was a common joke to show that women were automatically disgusted by a male body. Where, you know, a woman walks in on her husband in a bathrobe or something, and she's like, ew. You know, that's a common trope in comedies. Not so much now, to writers' credit, but back then it was quite common. So that's what little TV I was allowed to watch. When I would see ads including that or something, that's what I picked up on. And so it was, yeah, I had this incredibly negative view of sexuality in general. And of course, this is when not just purity culture, but also preaching against homosexuality was becoming more common. And so, since that was the only time I heard the word sexuality, again, it reinforced the negative ideas of it. That didn't, the thing is, though, I still was attracted to women, and I had a great desire for romance. And so that's how we met and started dating.
Yeah.
Cutting the story a bit short there, but you should probably tell your side of this too.
Yeah, so like I did not have those same hangups. I did get the message, save sex for marriage, true love waits. But the idea was there that sex is good and pleasurable. You just have to wait for it. So I was eagerly waiting for it. And we made out while we were dating, and I thought he was interested and also eagerly waiting. And then I find out that he was not eagerly waiting for it.
I had the bright idea to tell her this on Valentine's Day. Yeah, feel free to reach the screen and punch me if you want.
Before, was that while you were engaged or before?
Yes.
Yeah, we were engaged.
Yeah. That had to be a bit of a disconcerting conversation. So were you, just for my clarity, Lars and Christie, I want to come right back to you, but were you expecting to get married and just like keep sex only for trying to get pregnant, or
what was... I didn't know. That's why I brought it up to her, because it's like, we're 6 months out, and I know people tend to have sex when they're married, and I don't want to do that. So or at least at the time I didn't. And so I'm trying to be the responsible person that I wanted to be. I brought it up to talk about, because obviously I knew that was an important thing to talk about. But I kind of figured she'd be relieved, because again, pop culture had taught me that women are always disgusted by sex, and purity culture had further reinforced the idea that men always have to coax it out of them at best, right? That women are never interested. And
also, she would be glad that you're not going to be banging on the door all the time.
I kind of assumed that she would be relieved to hear that. And it just goes back to the way that many religions, including Christianity, treat everyone as rubber stamped copies of each other, right? Where everyone has the exact same interests and drives and motives and preferences, and is a blank slate. And that's why you have to censor all the information coming in. Otherwise, they'll learn the wrong thing. Like, they might read Harry Potter and become witches, or they might see a movie where they use a word they don't like and start using that word all the time just because they saw it. When in reality, of course, even young children are able to exercise discretion. And if you tell them, hey, there's a word that maybe you shouldn't use, they probably won't use it. Yeah. Likewise with sexuality, simply being exposed to the fact that humans are sexual beings is not going to automatically make them run out and start raping anybody.
Yeah. So Christie, sounds like you were approaching this with a much healthier and joyful perspective. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, definitely.
How did you respond then to that conversation?
Well, I was shocked and disappointed. I still really loved him, so I wasn't going to dump him right on the spot, but it was like a deal breaker if he couldn't fix it. So, I made sure that he would talk to somebody about it and maybe change his views. And, if things weren't heading in the right direction, then we would have to have some more serious conversations.
Yeah, I think I was definitely more along the lines of where you were coming from, where I kind of thought, this is a gift from God, it's good. And I mean, honestly, I was looking or do it once a day and twice on Sundays. It was definitely on my radar for sure. And well, with your, I'm just curious with going back to the background thing of this too. I know a lot of people just feel like there's a dirty aspect to it, and even just being frank, the physical aspect of it. When a guy ejaculates, he's literally now got stickiness all over, and now a woman sometimes with either that reality of her being sticky after sex, or just her period. Some women I've read about, they just feel like their period themselves makes them feel very dirty all the time. Not that they obviously ever should, but just they feel like that's part of it. And especially when you weave in some of the passages in the Bible where you literally have to go outside the camp because you're unclean. And there just was there any kind of dirtiness for you that came into this, or did you just feel like this is just a beautiful gift from God? Let's do it.
I had no thoughts about it being dirty. Could be partly because my dad's a physician assistant, and so like there's this clinical medicalness to things. So the period is just like something that happens to your body, and I didn't learn about like ejaculation really for quite a while, but once I learned about it, it's just like, okay, that's a normal bodily process. So cool.
Yeah. Me having discovered it in the context of shame and ignorance, even today, I'm still not a fan. But I understand that, my perception on it isn't that important when in the act of lovemaking. So, but I was, very deeply ashamed of my male anatomy. Art history class, being homeschooled again, was always full of strategically placed post-it notes, including on David. And, it again just reinforced the idea that it was very shameful to have body parts, basically, especially genitals. And, so I couldn't understand how anyone could look at male parts and think they were attractive. Again, that also goes back to the homophobia that I was raised with, right? And I assumed that if we were to see each other naked, that we would forever loathe ourselves and each other afterward, because whoever looks on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her in his heart, as Jesus is supposedly said to have said. That didn't sound right, but
And then the Old Testament too has one about, I think it was Job.
I've made a covenant with my eyes not to look on a woman.
Yeah, exactly.
And so,
and when King David did it with Bathsheba, all hell broke loose. His life fell apart.
So I assumed that even basically finding a woman attractive was cruel to her, because it was objectifying her in some way. Yeah. And now the thing is, I wasn't even thinking sexually. I didn't know how to think sexually. It didn't. My brain didn't go there, right? But the act of finding them attractive was basically condemned as being impure. And so I assumed that if I saw her naked and she saw me naked, that we would feel both violated for being seen naked, and a violator for seeing someone else naked. And so like I figured it would ruin the relationship. Even after getting married, for years I couldn't see the same doctor twice if I'd had a physical examination, because I felt like I had been violated by having my genitals seen and touched, and violated them by letting them see it. And so I felt like I couldn't face them again.
So I'm guessing that nude art wasn't on your radar as something to be looked at.
No, it was not. I think I mentioned in the last interview that I didn't watch R-rated movies because I felt like I wasn't allowed to, and a big part of that was because they could possibly contain nudity. The idea of discretion entering into that, where I could pick and choose which movies to watch, just never entered into the picture. It was a rule that R-rated movies were not to be watched, so I just didn't do it, or on the rare occasions that I did, felt terrible about it. Basically felt like I had murdered somebody or something. The same with the one time that I used a crude word prior to deconversion. I felt guilty about that for years, as if I'd physically harmed somebody. All the while I was still supporting things like the death penalty and bans on homosexual marriage, things that are actually bad. worrying about something that was just a word. That's how worse my conscience was by Christianity. But back to the purity culture thing. We did work on it. We are dedicated people. Realized there was a problem, and I read 6 or 7 books. Unfortunately, most of them from a Christian perspective, and only one of them actually helpful in any way. One of them actually was a Christian book by Kevin Leman called Sheet Music. So for those wanting a fairly gentle introduction to the idea of sexuality, I actually still would recommend it. But it was very hard. I didn't know how to perceive myself as a sexual being. And so even right up to the wedding day, I was nervous that I wouldn't be able to go through with it. I felt like I was confident that she wouldn't immediately run away if she saw me naked. So there was that. But I was afraid that I would lock myself in the bathroom and cry if she did.
Well, I've said this before in different interviews, but what a mind job Christianity can do to people. It's just crazy.
And for what it's worth, I suspect there are people of other Muslim people who probably have to deal with the same crap. I just haven't interviewed them myself.
Yeah. Especially the ones I would think where they're hyper covered. That's just it's got to be crazy. And there was an older, it was a movie on Netflix a while ago. I forget what it's called, maybe Stiesel, but it's about a Jewish community, ultra Orthodox, and the same way, but they actually have a sex scene, and it's just you're completely covered. You uncover just the bare minimum amount of clothing to get the job done, but you have your sheets over you. You're not, the guy's not touching the woman's breasts and kissing her like that. He's just on top of her, get it done in 30 seconds or less, because the goal is basically to get her pregnant. And it's just what a mind job. There's no, the whole, you mentioned the word love making, you're not actually making love. You're just doing an act, and such a huge deprivation of what life could be.
And it goes along with the general denigration of pleasure that many religions, especially modern Christianity, that they espouse. Shortly after we got married, skipping ahead just a little bit, but we went to a marriage Christian marriage conference, and it was not super helpful. But the person giving the talks had also written a book on what he called pure pleasure, which it caused Christie to realize that, or at least it prompted her to bring it up to me, that I had a problem with feeling pleasure. I didn't know how to feel good about feeling good. And she was right. And that was perhaps one of the earliest seeds of our deconversion, when I started learning to actually take joy in pleasurable sensations, as opposed to feeling that they were to be regarded with suspicion or ignored.
How did you handle that growing up, Christy? Did you see pleasure as a good thing?
Yeah, in general, I didn't really look down on it too much. There was sort of this, I think it's Kantian idea where your motives are important. So you can do the right thing, but with selfish motives, and that makes it bad. But in general, as long as you weren't sinning in your actions or in your motives, then there was some room for pleasure in life.
I was curious, did either of you or both of you get any kind of talks, either from, I'm assuming this is a no from Lars, but from parents or even just good friends, Christian friends, about masturbation or any of that kind of stuff? Was that on the cards for topics to talk about?
Well, as a woman, nobody even mentioned masturbation for a woman. I didn't learn about it until college, that it was even a possibility. I knew that guys were getting talks about how they shouldn't do it. They would sometimes have separate chapels at college where the guys would have one and the girls would have another. And I knew the guys were having talks about don't masturbate.
Yeah, we had those at Lancaster Bible College for sure.
Yeah. When I was 16, my mom gave me a book from Focus on the Family about shockingly not too terrible, at least by purity culture standards. I mean, it still reinforced the idea that sex shouldn't be done except by a cis man and cis woman in a legally recognized marriage.
By Jim Dobson, the book.
I believe it was.
Okay.
It was a long time ago. I think it was probably written like 92 or something. But it did mention, for example, that it's pleasurable and that there is motion involved, and that it can bring couples together. These are things that were new to me at the time. But unfortunately, because it was like 5 years after the initial trauma, it didn't really make much of an impact. It didn't change my views to be something closer to something to look forward to. It did mention masturbation and didn't actually condemn it. Again, somewhat surprising, but that was about the only good message I took from the book. So I never actually felt that guilty over masturbation itself. But yeah, that was it. That was those two instances, the awkward talks and that book, were my entire sex ed growing up. So leading up to marriage, I finally sat my mom down and said, "Mom, what is a period?" I was 25, right? I didn't know. I was afraid to look. And to be honest, I was being a little bit spiteful. I could have looked it up on the internet, but I kind of wanted my parents to realize just how badly they had dropped the ball on this. I tried to tell them, and I don't think they understood. So by asking that question, I think it helped, because my youngest brother, sometime not long after that, because he was about 13, was given a talk on what periods are and how they work. So at least I think I did a bit of good there by bringing that directly to their attention.
That's crazy. That's the basics of life. Just we're so sheltered.
Yeah. I didn't know, how babies came out, obviously, for a long time. Certainly didn't know how they got in. But we finally got to the day of the wedding, went through the wedding ceremony, and well, you should probably explain what comes next.
Yeah, so we had a 4-hour bus ride to get from our wedding in the DC area to New York City, where we were starting our honeymoon. And I had a blanket covering us. We were sitting next to each other on the bus. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to, wait to start sexy things until the hotel room. But, I was eager to get started. So I took his hand and put it on my breast. And things went really well. It was a good way of easing into it. So by the time we got to the hotel room, we were able to go through with it. But
not just able, eager.
Yeah, I mean, I was ready.
But I was actually ready and eager as well. That moment was like a light switch going off in my brain. That it suddenly, it all came together, and I realized that, oh, this is enjoyable. I'm allowed to enjoy this. She's enjoying this, because she forced the issue. Like I couldn't have reached out myself. That would have been, it would have felt like assault to me if I'd done that. So her starting things off was, I think, really what I needed. And since that time, we've done pretty well. Don't need to go into a lot of details, but every day and twice on Sundays isn't far from the truth.
Yeah, as it should be. But it's amazing too, though, what you're bringing up, though, the idea of, it's really hard to flip that switch, like when you've been kind of told either it's bad 100,000 times, or you've been kind of just given this silence, but it's like, it's kind of a secret, so don't talk about it, which makes you assume it's kind of bad. To flip that switch is very hard. And even people who grew up more like Christie, where it's like, no, it's a good thing, I can't wait to enjoy it, just want to wait till marriage, but in marriage, let's do it, it's beautiful. Even people like that sometimes, I think, have this struggle where you're really not used to the idea of enjoying yourself and being intimate. And I get it that there's definitely some bad choices that young people can make, and we need to be protective of them and help them understand, ways that they can ruin their lives very early in life. But at the same point, there needs to be some ramping up to say, it isn't just like 0 to 60, on your wedding night. There's definitely a spot, for at least education, and definitely the message of, this is totally fine. This is normal. It's pleasurable. It's good. Don't feel any shame about it at all.
Yeah. Surprisingly, once we actually got to the honeymoon suite and thereafter, we haven't felt shame around each other, and
Hmm.
that
That's
is
awesome.
surprising, and not everyone has that experience. Um, I think it boils down to both of us being very pragmatic people. Once I was sure that there wasn't actually a problem, then my biology took care of the rest, I guess.
Hmm. That's so cool. It's good. It's good to hear some good endings. Sometimes you don't
Yeah.
hear this. I remember even when I was when I was a Christian. I remember years ago this guy at church, he came to me and he said, that was before I was married, but he said, Tim, I really need someone to talk to. And I was like kind of quasi on staff. I was like an intern at the church. And he just really wanted to pour his heart out. And even though I wasn't married, he was like, I just got to talk to somebody. And we were the same age. So we went to the mall for like 2 hours, and just walked around. And he's like, I've been married for 6 months and my wife doesn't want me to touch her. She can't, it's like, she gets out of the shower and she quickly covers up. And he's like, he's just dying inside. And I thought, how horrible. And these were, as far as I knew from the outside, two lovely Christians. But there's a lot of people where, as opposed to your story, where even with all the mind jobs that are happening, they don't really end up too happy at the end. Like they don't. It just doesn't work itself out. And I think I remember reading too. I was working on a book about sexuality, ironically, right before my deconversion, and I was reading a lot of books. And there was this one book I read. I forget what it's called, but they were talking about people who had in their teenage years pledged their virginity, and this was sort of in quotes, to Josh McDowell, because Josh McDowell was this apologist who also did the True Love Waits thing. Others did the same thing. Jim Dobson, I'm sure, had the same messaging. But and I even went. I heard Josh McDowell in person. It was like Newsboys or something, for the first 45 minutes, and then Josh McDowell would talk about wait for marriage. But the book was saying these girls were pledging their virginity to Josh McDowell as teenagers, and then they would get married, and they'd say they wanted to die because they really didn't want to have sex, and they felt like they had to because they were, this is the guy I love, I want to please him, and I'm want to obviously have kids. But at the same point, their emotions were just like, I just feel like dying. This isn't what I wanted. And it's so needless. Like, what are we doing to our kids?
So now, like I said, things were pretty good. We were married in 2009, and if we fast forward 12 years, that's when we deconverted. You can hear more about that story in our previous interview. When we did, it was like another light switch went off. When you remove the invisible, judgmental, non-participatory third partner from the equation, a lot more avenues open up. It's not to say that we were slouches, but when you realize that the only things off the table are the things that you just don't want to do, as opposed to something someone else doesn't want you to do, you can ask a lot more questions. Like, do we want toys? Are we completely straight? Are we completely monogamous? Are we completely cisgender? These are all questions that Christianity, or especially evangelicalism, basically doesn't let you ask. Maybe some people are okay with the toys, but a lot of, there's sort of an implication that there's something dirty about them.
Yeah.
And
the slippery slope.
yeah. And so, these are questions really that if you're going into marriage or into a relationship, you should probably ask right at the outset so that there's no surprises later on. There are no small number of people who, for example, have gotten married and eventually one spouse is like, I'm sorry, I'm just not attracted to people of your sex. I'm attracted to people of my sex. And, they try to get married to try to pray away the gate, and it doesn't work. But if you were free to ask these questions ahead of time, these things might be avoided. Or conversely, people who are attracted to multiple genders may be interested in experimenting together or separately with their spouse. And if there's trust all around, then they can do that. But within the evangelicalism, cis man, cis woman, legally recognized marriage for life with perfect fidelity, there's just no opportunity to explore any of these questions. And, I would urge anyone who is still in that situation to at least be willing to ask the questions. You can arrive at the same answers that you started with. That's fine. But then that they're actually answers and not simply assumptions that have been handed down to you.
Yeah. Christy, were you the first one to bring these topics up, or was Lars? And who who responded?
We really just had a lot of conversations when we deconverted, and it was a back and forth. It just being free to be ourselves, like not having some sort of assumption of what you should do or shouldn't do. It was just really freeing, and it made us closer together. And that came out in the bedroom.
Do you think that I know we talked a little bit about evolution before, but do you think that realizing, I mean, you mentioned just a minute ago that, this invisible God isn't there watching you have sex, which is really kind of, Christian kink, but realizing too that, we are evolved animals, and we are definitely very evolved. We're very conscious and we're very different, but we're still animals. And that there is a part of that that's like, okay, so we wouldn't impose a bunch of rules and tell, deer or rabbits how to do it. Why are we putting so many rules on ourselves? But did evolution and just bringing that part of it into it help at all, or was that not related?
Even before officially deconverting, yes. Really understanding my own biological nature helped me to feel a lot better about the parts of my body. I mentioned earlier that I felt very ashamed of it, and even well into marriage. But I wouldn't say the shame disappeared entirely. I wouldn't even necessarily say it's entirely gone today. There are times when I still feel a little wigged out about my own body, but it definitely did a lot to help reduce it, realizing that, yeah, I am an animal. And even before I officially deconverted, I kind of mentally checked out of the idea of a soul and realized that no, I am my body. I am a meat machine. I'm not just a ghost piloting one, right? And yeah, when you're a meat machine, use the meat a little better.
Yeah. I was just going to add too, one of the things that I think a lot of people struggle with the whole guilt and shame issue too is the idea of fantasies. And I know for me, that's something that I struggle with, whether or not that was, an appropriate thought to have. But I know that for me too, like one of the most freeing things is I began to really give myself the freedom to just fantasize and to eventually even write erotica. And I know that unfortunately you can't put that stuff on YouTube, or they'll shut that channel down. But I'm looking for venues where I could publish some of that writing. But to be able to put that stuff out there and say, yeah, it's okay to write erotica. It's okay to have these desires. And even if none of them come to in terms of real life, just like it's cool to think about it. It's your brain. Nobody's, this isn't North Korea. No one's going to judge you for thinking certain things. But at the same point, there is still, like you're saying, Lars, there's residual guilt that still stays there. I think just knowing how much of our culture would judge you, especially Christians, in our lives, if you were to just come out and say, hey, I'm writing erotica, or hey, I definitely enjoy thinking about different fantasies. They'd be like, no, that's totally inappropriate. And you kind of feel like you need to pull it back and not quite show all your cards, because you don't want people to think badly of you. But at the same point, you want to be free to be yourself. And honestly, I totally enjoy fantasizing myself. I'll put that out there.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, just, it's not that there are not any sins, any actual acts that are off the table, but also, the thoughts, not having any thought crimes is really freeing, to not judge ourselves for what we think and not judge the other person for what they think. And you can be more honest with yourself and with your partner, and actually, act based on how you're actually thinking and not what you think you're supposed to be thinking.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think too, there's one of the things you mentioned this before, Lars, I just want to piggyback and bring it back, is the idea that when you are thinking more freely about sexuality, you do kind of wonder if you're treating other people, either in your mind or in reality, as a piece of meat. And that comes up a lot, like even just in Christian dating, don't kiss her too much or whatever. Don't be fondling when you're, not married yet, because you're kind of treating her like a piece of meat. And I think that that mentality really does a mind job. Like, it's okay to just want to have sex. It's okay to not want to be, emotionally connected with every single person you meet. It's okay to just want to purely have sex. It's okay to just want to have a sexual release. But at the same point, you obviously want to be very loving to other people, and you do want to emphasize more the emotional connection in the midst of the physical. And I think the idea of wanting to not treat other people like a piece of meat really ends up, I think, messing with some of our minds. It ends up making you feel like, I can't go down that route because I'm really not being respectful to other people. And I remember even having, I think it was a preacher or some kind of radio program I listened to years ago as a Christian, where they kind of said, if you're masturbating and you're thinking about someone else, it's kind of like you're mentally violating them, because they don't know you're doing it, and they don't want you to do that, if it was real life. So you're kind of like mentally violating them. So don't do that. And I think it really is hard to think through that. I was curious what your thoughts are on that topic, or how you would phrase it.
I mean, yeah, for me, that's part of why I avoided learning anything about sex. I didn't want to have any sexual thoughts. Even when we were married, I was somewhat stymied in my ability to research because I was afraid if I did any reading or research on any sexuality, then I would be thinking sexy thoughts about someone who wasn't Christie. And so I couldn't learn. That's why we couldn't watch R-rated movies. They might have boobs that weren't hers. And so, like, in fact, one time we started watching a TV show, and we're surprised when it had a scene of nudity in it. And so, like, I just immediately like scrambled to find the remote and turn off the TV. And I didn't explain to Christie that this was because I felt like I had just cheated on her. She thought it was just, oh, that was more extreme content than we were willing to watch at that time. For me, it was an absolute traumatizing experience because I didn't know what to do. I had just accidentally done the worst thing as far as I was concerned. And again, when you have all your assumptions handed to you, you don't question them, you don't raise them. And so I didn't feel like I could say, oh, wow, I'm so sorry I saw that naked picture there. And she could have said, oh, I don't care, it's just art, and we could have actually had a conversation about it. But because we were still stuck with each of our own evangelical assumptions, hers were, a lot more in line with reality than mine at the time. Because, I think I've correctly characterized your attitude at the time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was raised with the idea that there was simply no difference between nudity and pornography. And so
that's a big topic.
Yeah, it's its own thing. But
and my assumption was he was turning it off because we could expect more of the same, like there might be more nudity and more nudity and more, like I just figured it was, if it was coming up so early on in the show, then it's probably going to keep coming up and we better just choose a different show. But for him, just having it the one time was bad enough.
Yeah, it was, and I felt terrible for having even suggested watching it because I hadn't done my research. And again, it sort of reinforced to me the idea that I couldn't just exercise discretion on what to watch, that I had to be about the rules. And, but when we deconverted and started actually asking these questions, we realized, for example, I don't tend to have spontaneous sexual fantasies. It's just not a thing my brain does. But on the rare occasions that I do, I had actually thought about someone that we knew. And
I had thought about it too.
Like,
I had the fantasy of him with this other woman.
And that was like a revelation. Like, oh, you mean you find that interesting? Huh? We haven't actually done anything with that person, but like, it's nice to know that we can talk about these things and not feel ashamed for just having thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. It's crazy the way that we truly make ourselves hide. And I think that's one of the biggest issues within marriage, and not just deconverting people, but just in general, like to tell people there's parameters of what you can reveal about yourself. But if you tell me your truest heart of hearts about whatever topic, that's where your cross lines. I just don't want to hear it. And you end up in a spot where you're just not safe. You're not safe to share your truest heart anymore. And once you start down that road, you say, no, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. Well, all of a sudden, then the person that's being shut down has to either keep it all to themselves or find other places to talk about it. And it's like, now you're the spouse that's pushing the person to be private is ending up basically destroying the foundation of the marriage, because now you're like, you're not safe, you're not a safe person to talk to. And it's a lot of it is mixed in, of course, with the judgmentalism. Like, I have parameters for what sexuality can look like, and if it diverges at all, then to them, you're not a safe person, because now you've diverged from the straight and narrow, so to speak. And it ends up, it's just the idea of saying, look, tell me who you are. Nothing, unless you're into something that's truly illegal, and obviously we're not talking about that stuff. But if you're talking about, adult relationships that are healthy and mutual, then there's nothing that's off the table in terms of at least talking about it. And it's a big deal. And it's sad that you pretty much you have to keep it to yourself.
I was judgmental as well as a Christian. It wasn't just Lars, but he was judgmental, and I didn't feel safe talking about certain topics with him. And so deconverting has really made our marriage so much better, because everything is able to be talked about.
And don't get us wrong, it was good already. It's just those parts where, where there was that lack of safety, we didn't get to explore those. And now we can explore them a lot more fully.
That's awesome. I know that the deconversion is a big, story, and we talked about it in depth last time, but can you go into more details about like how it actually converts or changes your sense of I guess purity culture as well as sexual morality? Just how does it change it all for you?
I mean, basically we had to go through and rethink everything of, okay, so if we don't have this external rule, we have to come up with ourselves, like, what are the things that we think are ethical and are not. And there are a lot of differences in what we think are ethical compared to what we used to think. We don't condemn homosexuality, for example. And our ideas of like consent being the main thing that makes sex ethical or not, it is totally different from how we used to think.
And safety.
Yeah.
How did it change for you, Lars?
Much the same. Again, like I mentioned earlier, I'm very pragmatic. And so once I had it in my head that I can reform these ideas with values rather than rules. So in this case, values around sexuality being consent and safety. We've been able to try a lot of things that we just wouldn't have before. And what I do find ironic is that, like toys, for example, are never explicitly condemned, or rarely explicitly condemned from the pulpit. And yet there's this general idea among evangelicals that you shouldn't use them. Why not? Like, I seriously doubt they could ever come close to making a case from even the Bible that there's a problem with them. And yet we didn't feel free to try them out until after we deconverted. It's just that general willingness to try something. Again, realizing that if you try something and you don't like it, it's not a sin. It's just a thing you didn't like. It's like food, right? I can try, mushroom risotto and find that I do or don't like it. And if I like it, I'll have it again. If I don't, I won't have it again. And that's it. Like, it's not really all that complicated when you boil it down like that.
And it's not going to affect where you go after you die or how many crowns you get.
And you're not completely tainted or sullied or dirtied by something you did.
It's I think it's one of the Timothy epistles. It says, "Whoever joins himself to a harlot is one with her." The idea that sex is this mystical bond between two souls it's not even just evangelicalism. That kind of permeates a lot of different aspects of culture. I remember seeing it repeated in an episode of Bones even. And it goes along with the idea of substance dualism, which is more philosophy than we need to get into right now, but the idea that you have some sort of mystical soul that is distinct from your fleshly material body, and that somehow sex can connect people together that way. Well, it's just because you experience powerful emotions during sex, and people tend to attribute powerful emotions to a mystical soul rather than brain processes. But they're brain processes. And, yes, they can affect you going forward. As I mentioned, you can have traumatic experiences. But when you go into it with a welcoming attitude of let's try it out, it's much less likely to be traumatic if you end up not liking it. You're just going to be like, oh, okay, this is not for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we're going to keep this interview a little bit shorter, but I did want to ask, number one, of course, are there any parts of the purity culture topic you wanted to bring up, but also to ask this question, and you can bring up anything else first, then we'll maybe wrap this one up with this question. Once you get to this point where you feel more healthy and whole and free, and you're just being yourself again, kind of discovering who you were and who you should have been this whole time, and really bonding together, which is a really cool part of this. But you realize looking backwards that there's so much trauma, there's so many bad ideas that just took over, and you kind of alluded to that they're still there in some ways. There's Christians, of course, that want to either directly in our lives or at least indirectly by their Facebook posts or whatever, they kind of want to remind you that God's watching, God's judging, so you kind of get re-triggered. How do you just heal from trauma, especially the purity culture trauma, in a way that just gets to a point where you're just like, you know what, like that whole part of life is it's just over. Like the whole part of life where I feel ashamed because I want to think about sex or have sex or do this or that or explore, the whole part of life where I feel ashamed of it is just done. I'm now a different person. I'm like, it's night and day. um how do you get rid of as many bad ideas and ignore as many triggers as you can and just be yourself?
Well, I didn't have that many traumas myself from purity culture. It was the most trauma was, interacting with Lars and him telling me he didn't want to have sex. But I did have a little bit around the idea of modesty. Of when I would go swimming, I had to wear a one-piece swimsuit with board shorts, and like the shorts had to be long, and I mean, some of that was a little self-imposed. Like, I think, if I didn't wear the shorts, my parents would have been okay with it. But, I felt like I should be wearing covering up as much as I could. For a while I was wearing like, you know, for high school, I was wearing like polo shirts and really long skirts. And there was the idea of covering up. They had rules in my high school. It was a Christian high school of like, no spaghetti straps and things like that. And I never even came close to breaking those rules because like I already had my own rules that were even stricter.
Hmm.
So, it's been a pleasure exploring, how I want to dress now that I'm not a Christian anymore. I wear bikinis and shorter shorts sometimes, shorter skirts, sometimes I go without a bra. And it's freeing.
Hmm. And Lars, same question for you.
For me, I found the best way to deal with it is to like talk about it with others, including a therapist. I actually did talk to a sex therapist for several sessions on like how to more fully integrate my personal identity with my sexual identity, because it all, even after being married for a long time, it still often felt like putting on a costume to take off my clothes. And the other thing is facing it head on. I mentioned art movies a few times. Well, I have deliberately, consciously started watching them on purpose. And yes, I have gotten anxiety attacks a few times while doing so, but it's getting better. The more I watch it and realize that they are, in fact, actually movies made with the purpose of entertainment or enlightenment or, to elicit an emotional reaction, as opposed to the bundles of corruption I was raised to assume that they were, the more I'm able to just sit back and watch them and enjoy them as movies and not as, packages of sin. Um,
Hmm.
and the same goes for trying new things together. Like, okay, the first time we tried a toy, it was a little scary. Like, are we okay with this? Yes, turns out we are. And just again and again facing the assertions of purity culture or evangelical culture more generally and seeing if they actually hold up to the real world. And as it turns out, hardly any of them do, or at least the ones as regards your behavior. If it's like, if you behave in this way, then you will whatever. Now, it is true that if you discover that evolution is true after being told all your life that it's not and that it's against God, yes, that does tend to make you want to question the whole idea of God. But that is more the fault of those telling you that it's incompatible in the first place, because there are, in fact, many Christians who have no problem with accepting the reality of evolution. I still think they're wrong about the faith things, but at least they're not denying obvious reality. But
well said.
when that's then the message, sorry, Ken Ham is producing more atheists than Richard Dawkins. So.
It's funny in some ways that I obviously don't use this platform to help have Christians like preach and stuff, but I do a little bit. And I think it's probably obvious to anyone that's a long-term watcher of mine. The reason I'm doing it is I feel like they're burying themselves deeper. It's like, yeah, keep talking, keep telling me about why we need blood magic and why we need to do genital mutilation. And it's just like, keep talking. You just sound more foolish as you go on.
Yeah.
But
I mean, more generally, one of the biggest things for me deconverting is being able to recognize morality for what it is. I was raised, she was raised with a big stack of rules. And as it happens, we both have exceptional memories and are very good at remembering and following a big stack of rules. It makes us good at board games. But, if all you're doing is following rules, you're not even really exercising morality. You're just following orders. And, the Nuremberg trials remind us that just following orders is not a good enough reason to excuse bad behavior. And so I've had to do a lot of thinking and studying about what it means to be moral. And, I think I've settled on some pretty good values of, trying to improve the happiness, health, longevity, and reduce harm to thinking beings, which I think will include more than just humans too. I think we need to treat animals better. I eat fewer of them than I used to, and may eventually go to the point where I eat none at all. And when we can look at goals and values like that, instead of a bunch of rules, we can adjust our behaviors and actions according to their actual consequences. And as a result, I can be a better, happier person than I was before. One of the things that bugs me the most when I talk to people about the fact that I'm not a Christian anymore is they'll almost immediately jump to some variant on, how am I still moral? Where do I get my morals from? Or did I just want to sin or something like that? And, well, yes, there's nothing wrong with wanting to sin, because sin is just doing something that God doesn't like. It doesn't really have anything to do with morality. But more to the point, no, I want to be moral, and that's why I can't be a Christian anymore. Even if I thought it were actually true, I don't think it's good. I think humans are neither fundamentally good nor evil. We're fundamentally monkeys, and we do monkey things. And if we want more human monkeys walking around, and we tend to want that, or at least to maintain the population and not kill each other and die early, then we need to do certain things to make that happen. If we want to enjoy this monkey life that we have, then there are certain things we can do to make that happen. But really, it's all about, what do we agree are good goals and values, and what can we do to make those happen? And to the point where we agree, we can make moral progress. When we disagree, we have conflict and war. It's what happens. Is it good or bad? Well, it's what happens.
Well said. Well said. And it's amazing to me. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but it's the idea that we would look to the Yahweh character, especially. It's beyond. And I know Jesus in some ways is a little bit better, but he says, I and the Father are one, and I've not come to destroy the law. I've come to fulfill it. It's like, he's agreeing with everything that the Yahweh character does in the Old Testament. So it doesn't really make it much better. But
he still called the Gentile woman a dog and told the disciples when they were to, in the act of excommunicating, to treat someone as a Gentile. He's still advocating racism.
Yeah.
Again, supposedly, let's be clear here, there's no particularly good reason to attribute any of the words attributed to Jesus actually to him, because they were written decades after he supposedly said them.
Yeah, absolutely. If not much longer. So one question, I'm going to throw one more in there. I know I said it was last question, but I do this sometimes. I think of another one. I just want to kind of slip it into the last minute. A lot of people look at the topic of pornography as, immoral. And I want to clarify, I'm not talking about pornography where people who made it are exploiting other people, where it's involving sex trafficking or something like that. I'm talking about consenting adults where it's completely, and there are sources you can go to for pornography that is not in any way exploitative, but a lot of people would look at it and say, like, say one person in a relationship does look at it, the other person in a lot of Christian circles I've seen especially would say that that person that's looking at pornography is effectively abusing the other spouse. And I was curious of your thoughts on that. Both generically, is pornography okay, but is it abuse for one person to look at pornography if the other person is not okay with pornography?
I would say it's at least a violation of their marriage, how they, or whatever the relationship they're in. If they have both talked about pornography and one has said, I don't want you to do it, and then one does it, that is a violation. It's if they were both agreeing that it's fine, then it's fine. But I would have a problem with either doing it behind their back, or even doing it with them knowing when they said don't do it. Yeah, it would be breaking some sort of trust, and I think that's the more important value.
Yeah, that's what we found. Like when we deconverted, we had to ask ourselves, what does our marriage mean to us? If it's not a vow before God and man anymore, if it's an agreed upon partnership, what does that mean? And we kind of boiled it down to keeping trust with each other. So as long as there is transparency and trust in our actions with each other and with other people, then we aren't cheating on each other, right? Whatever that might look like. Whether it's seeing a flash of boobs in an R-rated movie or something else, as long as there is understanding between us that these things are fine between us and I won't feel offended if you do them and you won't feel offended if I do them, then we're good. And yeah, is that more complicated than whoever looks on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her in his heart? Yeah, but it works a lot better in the real world.
I'm going to throw one loophole into this, or a different scenario. What if one person in the marriage is severely depriving the other person, where they haven't had sex hardly ever? Maybe they do it. Some couples, they would say they're feeling that strain of like, this isn't enough, but they still have sex once a month or something. Other couples, it's been, a couple of years or more. But they decide for whatever reason they're going to stay together for kids or other reasons, and it's a bad situation where one person is just ready to go, like we joked about before, once a day and twice on Sundays, and someone else is saying, I'm not up for it much or at all for whatever reason. I know that's not a good marriage situation in general, and I'm not saying that they should see that as healthy. They should obviously work to fix the marriage in general, sex or no sex, if possible, or they should figure out if it's time to cut ties and move on. But for the people that are married and they're just going crazy wanting to be sexually active, but they can't be with their partner, does that change it at all in your minds?
I think
I'm asking for a friend.
I think it would be essentially coming up with a new contract. Like, you say, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to watch porn, or I'm going to have sex with other people, or whatever the case, decide. And, that person who had been deprived tells their partner that, and like, not necessarily, you could do it asking first, but like, it is not fair to that person to be deprived for that long.
It's a breach of trust in the other direction, right? Depriving someone of sexual activity in a marriage where that was previously agreed upon as a tenet of that relationship is really no different than sleeping around with the next person that you find who's agreeable.
Yeah, agreed.
So, in that situation, it could be like, okay, we're agreeing to stay married, but married is not going to look like what you think it's going to look like.
Yeah. I found too, it seems like Christians in general want to control sexuality. Obviously, we've talked a lot about that, but even within marriage, they definitely, and I'm just because it's something I'm going through, it's something that I'm more sensitive to in other people's stories. But I'm definitely learning that they use sex as a weapon and a tool of control to make sure that they get their way. And it's just another evidence that, Christians are some of the most unloving people you'll ever meet. And to be directly using sex to harm and hurt your partner, their heart and their ability to thrive and flourish is just beyond comprehension to me. But it seems like it's a very common trope among Christian marriages. And I'm not saying it's only Christians. I'm sure it's other religions, and I'm sure atheists have done it too. But it's a sad context whenever it happens. But it seems like it's a truism that if you go into marriage, I mean, it should just be obvious. Like what I'm going to say, it should be just based like marriage 101. If you go into marriage, do it to just make the other person feel alive and thriving, as happy and healthy and whole and loved and accepted as you can. And I love the idea. Like I remember my I have an older brother. He and his wife, they apparently, I don't see them too much because they're up in Pennsylvania, but they apparently just love each other, and they just go out of their way to help each other in every way possible in life, to the point where they're almost trying to outdo each other. Like, no, I'll do it. No, seriously, no, I'll do it. I'll take care of the trash. They have this relationship where if you looked at they'd almost be like fighting about who's gonna bless the other person more. And I say that tongue in cheek, but I think it's a good thing that they're like, look, I want to make sure that you feel so cared for and so happy that I'm almost obnoxiously committed to making sure that my focus is off of me and on you. And I know that that's not necessarily completely healthy. Selfishness is an important piece of our lives, but just in a relationship to say, I really want to make sure you can thrive. Like, what do you need to even just to ask it? What do you need to feel as happy as you can be? And instead of trying to figure out, well, I don't want you to do this. I don't like you looking at that. I don't want you thinking these thoughts. Like, to be asking each other, what do you need to be super duper happy? And I don't see many Christians living that way. I really don't.
No, we did. Like as Christians, we immediately rejected the idea of my headship, or almost immediately. We made one or two decisions where I made the primary decision, and they weren't good decisions. Let's be real clear here. They were not good decisions when I was making them unilaterally as the head of the household. And we very quickly, fell into a much more egalitarian routine where chores are divided up by basically whoever hates them less. Big decisions were decided based on, or are decided based on, who has the bigger stake. If we're going to move or get a new job or buy a new car, who's going to be concerned more about the outcome of this particular thing, and they're the one whose vote is going to carry more weight. And in general, we're also pretty good at coming to some sort of equitable agreement on things. Like, for example, vacation planning. She's great at it. Car buying, I'm better at that, right? Like we play to our strengths and recognize our own weaknesses, and it makes for a great partnership. That's true in anything, right? If you have a business partnership, play to your own strengths and let your business partners cover for your weaknesses, and you're going to run a better business than if you just try to make all the decisions yourself.
Yeah, I would think too. Just you mentioned headship. I would think it'd be really helpful to, as you lose the headship mentality too, for just to realize that both people can initiate, and it's not about a man wanting to constantly saying, I want sex, can I have it? It's like, well, he can obviously be more respectful and learning of what she wants and her frequency and cadence and so forth, her desires, her pleasure, but also for a woman to say, he's not my leader. I don't need to look to him for when we're going to have sex. I can ask for it. I can initiate it. I would think that's a great thing. I mean, Christie, am I on the right path there?
Yeah. I mean, as far as sex goes, it was never that. Like, I've always been too reticent, I think, to initiate, actually, because I'm always worried that I'm going to be forcing myself to just express my will. And that was something I had to learn, to be, like you said, a little selfish, to be like, this is something I want. Now, it doesn't mean I'm going to just automatically get it, but it is perfectly fine to express that I want a particular thing. And then if it's going to involve someone else, then it's on them to decide whether or not they want to participate in that with me. I mean, that's just a general rule. It does also apply to sex. And, as I've learned to be, at least a bit selfish, I'm actually a better person because of it, because I'm not completely forgetting my own needs and then burning myself out on something I didn't really want to be doing in the first place.
And it's being more communicative, like I actually know what he wants instead of guessing.
Yeah, and I don't have to, I'm saying what I actually want instead of what I think she wants me to want.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, I know I've thrown a bunch of questions. I feel like in some ways there's a bunch more we could talk about, but this is a really good start. I'd love to, use the phrase, let's talk about sex. But I'd love to kind of maybe put some notes down the next few weeks and months, and at some point revisit maybe some topics and even bring another person or two in to talk about, other perspectives too. But this is it's such an important topic. I'm sure some people will not agree with us in certain areas, and hopefully it's just more of a, spurring on some discussions among different people to think how they want to do their lives. But to be sure to say, do we need to do it the way that our pastor kind of told us that even if we've rejected that, just to say it's still somewhere buried in our psyche, you can get rid of those roots and start to think that I'm more free than I've ever realized. I can start, hopefully a little bit of a tabula rasa there, a blank slate, and kind of, decide for yourself what is the best way to live my sexual life. But was there any other points or topics you want to bring up there before we wrap up for today?
I think that was covered. Sexuality and morality were big things that changed post deconversion, and I would say for the better. Yeah,
that's awesome. That's the way it should be. It's absolutely the way it should be. Christie, did you have any other thoughts you wanted to add?
I think we covered it.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your openness and honesty, and it's a hard topic to be so vulnerable about. So thank you so much, and I definitely look forward to doing another topic, hopefully some of these same topics, but diving even deeper. And just appreciate your story. You all are awesome, and thanks so much. Great to see you again.
Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.